Welcome everyone to the second panel. We have more or less the same participants around in the discussion around the table, and two keynote presentations, let's call them that way, by Venelin Ganev, who's a professor of political science at Miami University. He has, and he is a visiting fellow of IWM. He has, the title of his project is Après l'adhésion, le déluge, after the accession deluge, democratic governance in post-accession Eastern Europe. And then we have Adam Ramsey. He's the editor of Open Democracy Media Platform in London, and his project title here at the Institute is Understanding the Elite Networks Driving the Far Right. So I'm assuming we're... This is because I confused who's, our roles, our respective roles. I thought that you would be the moderator. And then we have Vejvoda, whom you all know, and needs no special presentation. So the theme we are basically continuing with the themes of this morning. This morning we were discussing the totalitarian responses and progressive dreams. Now we're returning to the main question as to whether the liberal democracies exist or what is at stake behind this notion. So I first give floor to Venelin.
Well, thank you. I will address the question whether illiberal democracies exist, but first let me say that the conversation about this regime type does exist, and I'm not sure when it started, but it certainly picked up steam and moved to the foreground of scholarly concerns in 1997, when Fareed Zakaria published an article entitled The Rise of Illiberal Democracy in the influential journal Foreign Affairs. So I think in some sense engaging Zakaria's ideas, or what might be called the Zakarian template, is inevitable and perhaps heuristically enriching. But, and that's the first thing I would like to say, we need to be intellectually alert. So I will make a plea for intellectual alertness. When we approach the phenomena we've been observing over the last dozen years, we should resist the temptation to resort to well-known historical analogies and seemingly commonsensical comparisons. And the reason for that is that actually the cases that Zakaria was working with, the countries he was looking at, or if you want technical terms, his universe of cases, was quite different from what we, and when I say we, I mean those of us who try to understand what's been happening in Eastern Europe over the last 10 years. So the cases he's looking at are quite different. These cases might be his cases might be characterized as incomplete democratizations. You know, in his own words, and I'll do a lot of this during my presentation because I'll be quoting a lot. So what he examines are countries that failed to mature into liberal democracy. So he's looking at some kind of, let's call them equilibria, which emerged as many autocracies began to democratize. And what happened there, to summarize his view, is that elections were pretty fair, votes were accurately counted, but practices of liberal governance failed to take root. So the question Zakaria was asking is why, of the two components of liberal democracy, democracy kind of began to emerge. It did materialize, but liberalism did not. This is Zakaria's question. What we observe in Eastern Europe, I would argue, is quite different, because the path which countries like Poland, Hungary, and so forth followed is not one of incomplete democratizations. What happened there, they are product, I mean, they might be co-illiberal democracies, but they are product of a very different political dynamic, namely the amputation of liberal components from the democratic body politic. That's what created illiberal democracy in Eastern Europe. So this might sound like a minor detail, the fact that, in what we have in one case, Zakaria's case, is incomplete democratizations, and what we have in our case, Eastern Europe, is, I call it democratic backsliding. We might argue about the most accurate description. That might sound like a minor detail because the outcome is roughly similar, but it's not a minor detail. So let me now, and here's my plea for intellectual alertness. Don't just, transpose Zakaria's thinking to Eastern Europe. So what are the implications of these two different paths, incomplete democratization as opposed to democratic backsliding? I can think of 4 implications of this fact that we reached roughly similar outcome, but through different paths or trajectories. First, and Professor Rupnik talked about that today, the first implication is that we cannot, in the case of Eastern Europe, I would argue, kind of disagreeing with Professor Rupnik, we cannot and should not invoke the longue durée, even though I am a fan of Fernand Braudel, but I don't think it's going to work in this case. In other words, looking at some kind of constants like political culture, illiberal practices. In the case of Zakaria, he talks about ethnic strife to explain the democratic backsliding. And the reason for that is that those who invoke Poland, for example, Poland's past, in order to explain Poland's recent backsliding, will find it impossible to explain why from the early 90s until 2015, for more than 20 years, all commentators and analysts, including Zakaria himself, celebrated Poland as a fairly decent liberal democracy. So the explanation we have to give to the backsliding must be such that it accounts both for the very, very true and palpable and tangible progress between the early 90s and the late 2000s, and then the democratic backsliding. Explanations of this peculiar pattern that look deeply into a country's past strike me as methodologically unsound. Second difference, Zakaria looks for a very good reason at institutional design, and most of the cases he examines feature a very strong presidency. Russia, for example. By the way, when I read Zakaria, I was struck by his prophecy here. Here's what he says about Yeltsin in 1997. He may well be a liberal Democrat at heart, but Yeltsin's actions have created a Russian super presidency. We can only hope his successor will not abuse it. Well, we all know what his successor did. So he says, the reason why we have these problems, Zakaria, is because of institutional design. I don't think that works in Eastern Europe at all. There were some countries where constitutional design was a problem, most notably perhaps Slovakia, where it wasn't really clear how power is distributed between the president and the prime minister, but these problems were fixed. And I frankly don't think that the argument that backsliding is because of the way institutions were designed makes a lot of sense. Third, we need to be more sociological than Zakaria, because what he ultimately describes is the preservation of a status quo. So there is kind of a status quo. It changes a little bit in the sense that elections now matter, but it doesn't change a whole lot because illiberalism does persist. So his account, he needs a sociology to explain that, but not a whole lot. We, in contrast, we need to do sociological work because things did change rather dramatically, right? The status quo was completely revamped. It was reconfigured quite drastically, quite rapidly. So then, given what happened, we need to be asking questions like, what social groups support the illiberal project? Why do they support it? What is the metrics of social meanings and imaginings that shape their preferences of those who support the projects? This is what I mean when I say that we, in contrast to Zakaria, we need to be more sociological. So here are 3 problems with Zakaria. They're not problems for Zakaria, they're problems for those who uncritically take his template and apply it to Eastern Europe. Short, lengthy causal chains, focus on matters of institutional design, and lack of the exploration of the sociological dimension of political change. To that, I'll add a 4th problem. So when Zakaria described the country as democratic but not liberal, he was referring to the opinion of people like himself. So there would be analysts, experts, commentators, and so forth. But the agents that he was talking, like the political actors, the leaders of countries like Singapore, so I'm talking about the 90s, Singapore, Slovakia, Peru, Zambia, these are countries that he deals with. These leaders did not invoke this juxtaposition. They didn't say, what I'm doing is democratic, but it's not liberal. No, what their defense or rhetoric was, I am building a liberal democracy in my own country, except that I'm trying to adjust this project to local circumstances. Singapore is different from Germany, therefore liberal democracy in Singapore will be quite dissimilar from Germany. That was the argument. Whereas now, this distinction or juxtaposition between democracy and liberalism is drawn by the actors themselves. They themselves say, what I'm doing here is certainly democracy that reflects the will of the people, but it's not liberalism because neither I nor my people like liberalism. So that is really something new. And it is at this juncture that I'll answer the question, does illiberal democracy exist? My answer is yes. But obviously, my approach to this question is, if we were phenomenological, I'm not talking about what actually exists out there. I'm not talking about conceptual distinctions or scholarly discourses. I'm talking about the rhetoric of political actors themselves. They are the ones who tell us, what we have here is a democracy that is not liberal. In that sense, it does exist. So it seems to me that this project of building an illiberal democracy can only work if the respective leaders, people like Orban, Kaczynski, Putin, and Erdogan, the project crucially depends on their ability, rhetorical ability, to draw the opposition democracy versus liberalism as sharply and as graphically as possible, and then to convince domestic constituencies as well as international audiences that what they're doing is proudly liberal, so it's not some sort of apocryphal illiberalism, or illiberalism under the carpet. No, it's proudly liberal, and at the same time reflective of the will of the people, and therefore fully democratic. So for the project to succeed, they must be able to articulate in a persuasive manner this juxtaposition. So in terms of political rhetoric, what is it that lends credence to this distinction? How can it be made to resonate with larger social constituencies? And why have the political entrepreneurs that reiterate this distinction, why have they been so successful? Obviously, this is a very complex question, but I'm going to focus on one thing, which I'm sure will make me very unpopular in this room. I'll be probably expelled from the institute and banned from ever setting foot in the building again. But my argument is that these illiberal entrepreneurs can and do draw on a globally available power resource, and this power resource is the aggressive rhetoric of anti-neoliberalism. Yeah. What I refer to is the rapid rise and consolidation of a particular grand narrative, and my reference to Lyotard is not accident. It is a grand narrative that explains every problem in every corner of the world as an unfortunate but avoidable after effect of something called neoliberal economic reforms or neoliberal politics, whatever that means. So by the early 2000s, which is about the time when Slavoj Žižek was officially announced as the most influential intellectual in the world, this grand narrative had attained a hegemonic status, I would argue. Again, Gramsci, not coincidental, my reference, in intellectual circles, in academia, and the mainstream media, particularly in English, the media in English. The views of leading pundits, academic superstars like Žižek himself, and the most popular op-ed writers converge on an interpretative framework which I call monocausal monodiabolism. Monocausal monodiabolism, which means the entire world is subservient to one evil force, and that's neoliberalism, and this evil force is the ultimate source of all problems. Monocausal monodiabolism. But first let me say, I don't really know what neoliberalism is. The term is thrown around frequently, never really defined, Because as soon as you define it, it's very easy to demonstrate it has absolutely nothing to do with East European politics in the 1990s. It is indiscriminately applied to basically all East European politicians, from, let's say, Bolshevik, in which case I understand, but also Putin has been called neoliberalism, and from Václav Klaus, and again I can see the point, but also to Bulgaria, Sergei Stanishev, who's a proud socialist, but has been described as neoliberal reformer. So the other thing I do not understand is how is a neoliberal different from a liberal? In a country like the United States, where liberal means the exact opposite of what it means everywhere else in the world, so liberal would be someone on the left, more redistribution, more welfare state, I see the point, okay? Liberals are on the left, neoliberals are on the right. But if by liberal you mean classical liberal, someone who believes in freedom, someone who valorizes individual rights, including the right to property and freedom of contract, someone who believes in limited government, then I find it really hard to see in a British context, for example, how is a liberal different from a neoliberal? And in some parts of the world, like Eastern Europe, this distinction makes no sense whatsoever, because the same individuals who will insist on freedom of contract, stable property rights, and limited governments will also be tolerant of, you know, gays and lesbians, will support refugees, and will believe in the rule of law. It's the same group of people. There may be some, you know, economic aspects, but ultimately it's the same because of history. And this is a contextual thing. I mean, it's a characteristic feature of Eastern Europe. I think Professor Rupnik referred to it. These are the former dissidents, and for them it's all one thing. So every stone thrown at a neoliberal in Eastern Europe will fall on a liberal's head, and the permanent marginalization of neoliberalism would result in the marginalization liberalism too cool. So let me now conclude by showing how this grand narrative of, the grand narrative about neoliberal villainy is strategically deployed by actors like Viktor Orban in Eastern Europe in order to legitimate the rise of illiberal democracy. So this grand narrative, one of it's like anti-neoliberalism, like all grand narratives, it's actually fairly easy to summarize. First, it is a form of very aggressive, vituperative scapegoating. Ultimately, it's all about who's to blame. Who's to blame, and the essence, of course, the new liberals. It reduces all complex questions to just this one. What is the guilty party? And it's very easy, the new liberals. So in Eastern Europe, the story goes like that. In the aftermath of 1989, Western profit seekers unleashed a large-scale effort to integrate the former Second World into a global economic system that serves the interests of capital. This project was carried out with the collusion of local legacies of capital, which are called neoliberal reformers. What these reformers did was anesthetize local populations with promises of consumerist bliss, and then push them into the abyss of actually existing capitalism. That is why these neoliberals who must be held accountable for every single suffering inflicted on post-communist society, from poverty, social dislocation, and economic marginalization, to the mistreatment of minorities, gender inequality, and the demographic shrinkage. And I'm sure, as Ivan knows, even the collapse of Yugoslavia. Some explain with reference to Pavic's neoliberal reform. So even that, like, why did it? Because of neoliberalism, of course. It is therefore imperative to resist the West's new colonial imposition by disempowering local politicians who endorse, rather than repudiate, the Western principles and values which progressive critics have long since discredited. Foremost among these discredited values is freedom. Another important tenet of the anti-neoliberal grand narrative is that freedom is a meaningless concept unless you possess a decent amount of cash. From this vantage point, political systems that valorize freedom, like liberal democracy, are inherently duplicitous and morally corrupt because they guarantee to the people something the people don't really need, freedom, and denying the people what the people really want, which is more money. And money, of course, I mean in a most general sense. Finally, what's wrong with liberals and neoliberals is that they consistently apply what is called critical reason to overly ambitious governmental plans. Beginning with Adam Smith onwards, classical liberals have always reminded audiences willing to listen that governments can be as corrupt, short-sighted, and self-interested as private corporations. Thus, the liberals, with their skepticism and criticisms, they create an environment or a climate of opinion that is permeated, that is inimical to the government's ambition to radically and quickly resolve societal problems. Liberal doubts about the efficacy, and normative justification of governmental action thus neuter or blunt the only instrument which, according to progressivist lore, humankind can use in order to protect itself from the slings and arrows of an outrageous fortune, to quote Hamlet, a famous skeptic. And that instrument is the series of massive, comprehensive, and forceful governmental interventions backed by the threat of coercion. So that's the grand global anti-neoliberal narrative. How is it applied to Eastern Europe? I'm going to discuss, and I'll conclude with this. Orban, the only sort of comprehensive statement, theoretical, ideological statement of defending illiberal democracy which we have so far, and that is Orban's 2014 speech in Transylvania. One of his main complaints, Orban's complaints, is that the Hungarian state was organized in accordance with what he called the liberal organizational logic, by which he meant that the powers of the state to intervene in various spheres of life, including the economy and the NGO sector, these powers should be limited. That's the liberal sort of idea. The problem with this logic, Orban announced, is that it was imposed on the Hungarian people from abroad. He proudly announced that since 2010, 2010 is when Fidesz came to power. Entirely new project has been created. An entirely new Hungary is being created, which he described as an illiberal state organization originating in the national interest. Clearly, Orban's project encountered resistance in Hungary. There were those who, protested and disagreed with his vision of Hungary, but he could dismiss them using the tropes of the anti-neoliberal discourse. More specifically, he depicted his opponents as self-interested actors who are ready to hurt their own people in order to serve the interests of the West. Fidesz reforms were resisted, he said, by political activists paid by foreigners. So any association with the West, even if you just took a grant from the West, is tainting the local activists and turns them into conveyors of foreign influence. Orban also made it clear that unlike liberal democracy, an illiberal democracy dedicated to the pursuit of the people's real interests does not recognize any limitations on its power to intervene in societal affairs, and announced that, and I quote, this is what he did: a committee will be formed in the Hungarian parliament that deals with constant monitoring, recording, and publishing foreign attempts to gain influence. In other words, contacts between local NGOs and Western sponsors. Secondly, he exposed liberal talk about freedom as misleading and deceitful. Here's what he says about freedom, and I quote: "This idea is very attractive on an intellectual level, yet it is not clear who is going to tell where the point is when my freedom is violated. And as nobody was appointed to decide this, therefore everyday life experience suggests that it was the stronger party that decided this. We constantly feel that the weaker were stepped upon." So this is the classic anti-liberal idea that freedom is nothing, it's just a facade behind which the strong exploit the weak. This is exactly the argument Orban uses when he says, why worry about freedom so much? What's the big deal? First of all, it's meaningless, and second of all, it's part of an alien agenda. The only way forward, Orban asserts, is to, and I quote again, "allow the political leadership to prioritize the interests and achievements of the community and the nation over the interests and achievements of individuals." Finally, Orban has no patience with liberal skepticism about the ameliorative effects of large-scale governmental action. The problem with liberal democracy, Orban pointed out, is that it was too timid. It could not possibly, and I quote, openly declare, even oblige, governments with constitutional power to declare that they should serve national interests. Moreover, it even questioned the existence of national interests. In other words, again, the liberal idea that we actually do not know what the national interest is and we need to talk about it and figure it out. It says it's pretty clear what the national, this is what the government says because it has a democratic mandate, and any objection to this, like any plea for further deliberations, simply impedes the government's sincere and benevolent efforts to improve the quality of life for its citizens. So liberal democracy is depicted by Orban and others, and Putin, by the way, as a crippled political system because its existential energies have been sapped and its healthy instinct for self-preservation diluted by a liberal narrative that features checks and balances, the rule of law, and seemingly universal, but in fact hollow values. In contrast, illiberal democracy is bold, ambitious, and daring. It acknowledges the fact that the order of the day is global competition, not among economic interests, but among nations. So the Orban's pledge at the end of his speech is that what he described disdainfully as an era of liberal state and liberal democracy is over, and an unabashedly liberal regime is being established that will, and I quote again, figure out, forge, and work out a new form of state organization that will make the community of Hungarians competitive once again. The truth about the world we live in, it seems, is that success is guaranteed only to illiberal states that recognize no limits on their economic, social, and cultural actions. In conclusion, I would like to sum up that I made 4 points. The first one is empirical. Backsliding in Eastern Europe is different from the incomplete democratizations in the 90s. The second is methodological. We need to be, research design comes to mind here, but it's a technical term. We need to be careful about the comparisons we draw as we try to understand what's happening in Eastern Europe. My third point is political, and that it is that the success of illiberal projects depends on the ability of leaders to articulate the dichotomy, or it's not a juxtaposition, probably is better, between liberalism and democracy. And my fourth point is polemical, openly polemical. In my view, the unstoppable rise of the anti-neoliberal grandiloquence and the ceaseless incantation of its battle cry, écraser l'infâme, like just eliminate if the neoliberals could somehow disappear, like Voltaire was thinking, Catholic priest, then everything would be fixed. Well, that created the environment, or it was one of several factors that created an environment that facilitated the electoral triumph of xenophobic populists and the permanent marginalization of important values and normative principles in Eastern Europe. And last thing I want to say is that there's actually nothing new about this, the revolt against liberalism. Ortega y Gasset wrote a book, The Revolt of the Masses, which was published in 1930, where he describes liberalism as noble and refined, but also paradoxical and anti-natural. There is something anti-natural about liberalism and its toleration of minorities. Why should you tolerate the minorities as opposed to breaking their heads if you hate them? So Ortega was wondering whether the same humanity that arrived at this idea should at some point appear anxious to get rid of it. So the desire to get rid of liberalism is always there. On several occasions, historically speaking, liberalism has staged a comeback, but there is no historical necessity here, so we might as well be entering a historical era, the historical era of illiberal democracy, an era when democratic actions will no longer be tempered by liberal principles.
Thank you. This was quite interesting and systematic. I quite enjoyed it. Okay, so next is Adam.
Sure, thanks. I think I disagreed with 85% of that, maybe 19. And so I'm going to talk through why a bit, which wasn't what I was planning on saying, but I think that's probably more interesting than just rambling off from what I was planning to say before. I think the first place I'd start is, you said that no one ever defines neoliberalism, and I just challenge you to say that's simply not true. There's lots of people who've attempted, and my favourite definition comes from the British sociologist Will Davies, who does it in 7 words, which is sublimation of politics to the market. I personally would see neoliberalism as a phase in the history of capitalism. So we had colonialism, where Western capital conquered much of the world, and then once it had geographically expanded to the boundaries of the world, it tended to turn back on the states, which had often supported it doing that, and sought to privatize the assets of those states. And of course, in the middle of that period, we saw the collapse of the USSR, and therefore the geographical expansion of capital in the kind of halfway through the neoliberal period into Eastern Europe and into Russia. And I think that's, a broad way to understand it. I also don't think there's very many people who think that neoliberalism is the only way to explain the problems of the world. The world is obviously a complicated place. We have structures of power that are those other than capital: gender, race, sexuality, etc. And I don't think there's almost anyone on the left, certainly the modern left, who would consider that neoliberalism is the only power structure and therefore entirely to blame for all the problems of the world in the way that you sort of characterize. I think that you need to be able to analyze the movement of capital in the world in the way that it influences politics without saying it's the only thing that influences politics. Obviously, there's lots of things going on all at once. The world is a complicated place. I think that the way I would see this, and in my day job, it's my job to investigate, particularly in the UK, the sort of ideological structures of power that steer the British state in particular, and sometimes steer global politics. And I think the way that I would see this is actually that we've moved beyond neoliberalism. And so, if the neoliberal period is, as I characterize it, kind of driven through its second half by expansion into Eastern Europe and Russia, then I think that what we then saw after that was a massive credit bubble, an attempt to construct a sort of, consumer market for capital. And then that burst in 2008, and that, as we all know, had lots of political implications around the world. And then in the last decade, we've seen an attempt to inflate even more asset bubbles. And so house prices in Budapest have doubled in the last 5 years. We've seen house prices in Ireland increase so much now that young people are voting for Sinn Féin in order to demand an end to the housing bubble so they can afford housing. We've seen the sale of inflated assets from Britain, from Ireland, from Hungary, from lots of countries to the Gulf, to China, to other parts of the world that are generally wealthier than we are. And of course, those things have political implications. I don't mean to say that they're the only things that have political implications. Of course, lots of other things are going on at once. But I think that we can't discount the significance politically of those basic economic facts. The increasing, as we were talking before, the massive rise in inequality we've seen over the last 30 years has important political implications. And so when it is that we investigate how very rich and powerful people and businesses steer British politics, which is the thing I know best, but also I can tell you a bit about Italian politics, a bit about Spanish politics, it's consistently the case that a very, very wealthy group of people produced by a set of economic policies that have applied in most countries across the Western world, the sublimation of politics to the market, has allowed them to take massive control of serious parts of the state. So in Britain, for example, huge amounts of public policy are now outsourced to people like PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Big Four. That's true of almost every Western government, which means that the traditional civil servants that used to make policy no longer do. I sometimes have a game where I just think of a random corner of the state and look up whether PwC or one of the other big accountancy firms has a contract to shape policy in that area, and I've yet to find one that doesn't. The biggest donors in the UK to the Labour Party before Corbyn came into power after the trade unions were PricewaterhouseCoopers, the accountancy firm who was writing Labour's education policy at the same time as advising clients who wanted to privatise the education system and run it. They were writing Labour's tax policy at the same time as advising clients who wanted to dodge taxes across the world. And this is true of most Western states. So, the extent to which capital is eaten into our states is beginning to have deep political effects. Another example of this, and I touched on this in my talk yesterday, is that in 1996, the government in the UK and other countries started to want to privatise that function of the military that is propaganda. So more and more of the military in Western states has been privatised. Britain at the centre of that. Britain has the world's most mercenary companies. And so G4S, the biggest employer on the London Stock Exchange, is a private mercenary company which has bases in Afghanistan and Iraq at the moment. When the Westminster voted not to intervene in Syria, they sent G4S in instead of sending British armies, and these are mercenaries. So they're privatising the very core functions of the state. And one part of that, the propaganda wing of that, the psychological operations wing of that, was a company called Strategic Communication Laboratories, who decided a few years later to spin off an arm called Cambridge Analytica, which is who ran Trump's campaign, which is effectively who ran the Brexit campaign. And so we can't understand the way that politics is changing and the kind of powerful actors in it without understanding that the production of a collection of very wealthy individuals and companies which no longer gain profit in the same way by going around the world, but instead are trying to eat up the states on which they previously relied, have achieved massive political power in our liberal states. And I think that that's not very surprising when we look at the history of Western liberal states. So again, I'll talk about Britain, which is where what I'm most familiar with, but the British political settlement essentially dates from 1660. It was a compromise between the monarchy and the aristocracy at the time. There's obviously been a series of other compromises in that period, including most importantly the mass enfranchisement of women and of the working class. But it's still the case that most of Britain's prime ministers have come from the same school, literally. That only 4 British universities have ever produced a prime minister. That the civil service was founded in Britain in the same government as they enfranchised most working class men, explicitly by the person who was responsible for British government policy during the Irish famine, in order to stop policy changing and ensure that the ruling class still had control over the British state. We still have in Britain, deeply undemocratic structures which aren't comparable to other places. We're in many ways worse than other places, the House of Lords, I could go on. But I think that you can extend the analogy and say that it is the case that modern liberal states were a compromise agreed largely in the 17th century and then copied in subsequent years, and were never really an effective way to answer to the question, how as people we negotiate how we live together. And so it's not surprising that when you go through periods of crisis, people look at those structures and find them alienating. I talked a lot about people's experience of government in my talk here yesterday. And it's not surprising that people can then be preyed upon. Now, I don't think that, people like Orban offer the correct solutions. I think what happens is that in that context of anger, the people who can take advantage of it are those with most power, those with the organizational capacity to mobilize that anger behind their ideology. And so this is what produces the Orbans of the world. It's what produces, all of the far-right leaders that we see right across the world. And just as an aside to this, I also think we need to, and again, I mentioned this yesterday, we need to think much more carefully about the class politics of support for these groups. So for those of you here yesterday, I gave the statistics on Trump supporters who are generally richer than Clinton supporters in 2016. It's the kind of media narrative that Trump got the working class vote in America is just not backed up by any data. I talked about Brexit and how most Brexit voters are wealthy people from the south of England, not the kind of working class northerners that we normally hear about. If you look at Hungary, which I'm not an expert in, but you look at the basic facts. So Hungary has, 90% of people in Hungary own their own home. 85% of people now in Hungary own their own home. That was the case, or rather live in a home owned by their family. That was 90% when Fidesz came to power. The asset bubble in Hungary has pushed a number of people out of that market, particularly young working class people in major urban centres. And those people are the people who are now beginning to revolt against Fidesz. The people who we see as, the sort of rural poor, although they are in terms of income poor, tend to own their own homes, tend to be a new asset earning class. And the main project of Thatcherism in the UK was producing a class of people who owned their own homes as asset builders, because they understood that those people would likely be conservative because they have a stake in the capitalist economy. And that it's not surprising that a country like Hungary or Slovakia has similar rates of home ownership, tend to produce a fairly conservative base, because most people own their own home. They own the most important asset they can have in the economy. And it's similarly not surprising that the people who can't any longer afford their home, because that economy over the last decade has been propped up through a massive asset bubble and been auctioned off to oligarchs of the world through essentially asset stripping, are beginning to backlash against it. And that's why you're getting the elections, as I would see it, of progressive mayoral candidates in the Visegrad 4 capitals, because those countries have seen massive spikes in the housing market, and that means people can't afford to buy homes, because as has happened in London over the last 2 decades, they're being bought out by oligarchs and the upper middle class. And so what next? I suppose, for me, as I say, the construction of states I mean, I'm not an expert in Eastern Europe, but I would copy a point that Jan made to me the other day, that Eastern Europe was told to try and emulate these sort of great examples of Britain and America. And what we've seen in the last decade is that Britain and America are not great examples of democracy. There's deep, deep crises in the politics of Britain and America. And the question for all of us, for all Western states, is, in the 21st century, in the 2020s, how do we govern ourselves in a way that isn't alienating, that is empowering, that understands that people have more access to information than they've ever had before? We have the most literate human populations in history. The planet's burning. We have a deep economic crisis, and the capital has no idea how to seek a return, and its response to that has been mass surveillance in order to desperately try and construct demand in order to make us buy stuff we don't need, which is causing the planet to burn. And if we don't find a way through this crisis by unleashing our collective genius through some kind of updated version of democracy, we're going to be in real trouble. So that's where I'll end.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, I'll have a question for you afterwards. Now it's Ivan's turn.
Thanks a lot. I'll try and be brief. This is not completely something different, but sort of looking at it from a different angle. And I begin with an article that appeared in the New Yorker in the last issue on Yuval Harari, which I recommend because, as you know, he's a big star, and he sort of explains the very big picture. And at one point, the journalist who wrote it said, well, Yuval says he's really concentrating on the big issues, and the big issues for him are climate change, nuclear, and especially artificial intelligence. And then the journalist says, well, what about inequality, terrorism, all of these things that we're talking about? He says, those are secondary. This is what we need. My sort of response to him as I was reading, I said, well, wait a minute, that's all well and fine, but we're living in the here and now. And, I want a kind of a stable life for myself and friends and family. And so what for him is secondary is primary to me, as we tackle, of course, the big issues that we've been discussing. I co-edited a volume with Mary Kaldor in 95-96 on democratization in Central and Eastern Europe, where we kind of wrote the quote-unquote theoretical introductory chapter, and where we used, of course, an idea that others who have written on theory of democracy have written, and that's the difference between substantive and formal democracy. This was actually a project for the European Commission then. They asked us, obviously, that for these countries that were going to join, they asked us to look under the skin of these forming democracies. And so that's what we try to do, and we invited 10 people from each of the candidate countries to write country chapters, and all people that you know. And we wrote the kind of umbrella chapter, and we came up with this idea, how do we describe what's going on? And the simple version of this is, the institutions are being built, we have democratic constitutions, we have judiciaries that are becoming independent, we have command economies that are turning into market economies, and all the trappings of sort of beginnings of rule of law, but they aren't infused with life, and they aren't infused with a political culture. And it's what many of you, and what Jacques was saying also at the beginning. And our conclusion was, you have to come up with something in the community. We said, so these democracies will be kind of sui generis democracies. Now, if you asked us then and now what did we mean by that, we simply meant it will be different than a Swedish democracy or a Westminster democracy. And that means that, and this goes to the theme of Ivan's and Stephen Holmes's book, and I'm sure what many of you others have written, we, in these countries that were communist or sort of softer versions like Yugoslavia, we all looked up to Westminster democracy and the green grass in Wimbledon and the US Congress. And it reminds me of two very liberal-minded Serbian philosophers whom Jacques and I met in '89, in a cafe of Hotel Prague on a sunny day. Jacques wanted to meet them because they wrote a very kind of critical book called Pluralism versus Monism, I think was the title, and they were advocating liberal democracy. And you know, these were supposed to be the people who would take us eventually after '89 and everything else into a liberal democratic or simply democratic society. They both turned out, of course, Koštunica beat Milosevic in the famous elections in 2000, but the reason I'm mentioning them is that they both turned out to be very nationalist after being very liberal. You know, they translated Locke, they wrote about Tocqueville, Koštunica translated the Federalist Papers, and you know, so what happened, and this again goes to you know, Ivan's theme of hypocrisy. They were then bombed by their ideal by liberal democratic countries, and so they sort of, to make a long story short, they became disillusioned and say, well, let's retrench around the flag. Somewhat more complicated than that, but you know, we need to stand up to these evil forces of, you know, whoever did evil things to us, and thus I do believe this issue of hypocrisy is important. And you know, I just love, you know, our new European Foreign Minister Josep Borrell reminding Polish and other East European friends that, you know, the US and the Vatican that helped them become democratic were the same United States and Vatican that kept Spain and Portugal fascist dictatorships for whatever it was, 30 and odd years. And thus things, as I think we've all said, are somewhat more complicated than simplistic interpretations put to us. I think there's a sort of we haven't mentioned political anthropology, kind of, you know, what is it that we have in certain moments mentioned it today, but you know, where have we come from? Well, in this broader part of the world, we've come from very rural societies. I mean, you know, up until 1939, most of these societies were, whatever it was, 80% peasant societies, relatively poor except for the, you know, elites. In educated, mostly educated in the West, elites. Then you have the war, and you know, when Istvan Bibor writes his book, there's that sentence he said, but these countries really never had a chance to take a deep breath and go forward, because you know, you had the First World War, then you had this brief period of, you know, 20 years, and then you had a second war, and then, you know, sort of communism was slammed onto them. So they never really got a chance to stand up. And then you had the communist period, and then you have the opening. And you know, I'm one of those, and I'm here with Venelin. I think freedom was really important. Yeah, of course, money is important. People want to live, but if I, you know, think of myself and sort of people in a broader circle, and remember that the dissidents whom we know or knew did have these oases of civil society, you know, whoever, whether it's Elimir Hankish who wrote about this, or our Czech friends who described that, you know, you do try and create these oases, these spaces where you try and live freely, surrounded by a dictatorship, a communist totalitarian system. In Yugoslavia, it was something different, but somewhat different, but it still was oppressive. So I think the urge, and this is where, you know, call it political anthropology or whatever, there is a propensity in individual human beings to want to have space to do whatever they want, maybe crazy things, you know, or like Voltaire, go do your garden. I mean, you know, not necessarily bigger things than, you know, living your own quiet life. And that's why Benjamin Constant, I think, is important when we consider these things. And so when the floodgates open and people, you know, burst forward, there is that recognition that this freedom is possible. Now, what happens after that, and that's again was part of this discussion, it's a big mess, right? it sort of goes in all sorts of directions, but the smer, the direction is towards a return to Europe, because that's where we belong. And you know, the Cold War and Yalta didn't allow us to go where we wanted. You know, my father was a student in Prague in the 30s. He was in prison because he was a young communist. He said, look, we had newspapers, we had books, we were allowed visits. It was very, very liberal. And as we know, Prague and the Czechoslovakia was a very democratic, you know, country measured by the 1930s. And then it gets thrown into darkness. And so there is, and this goes to Anna, there is a trauma in all this kind of political anthropology and this development from that rural to whatever went on. And then in communism, where you were told to shut up, otherwise you would be landed in jail, and suddenly things open up. And then in countries like mine, which fell apart, there's the additional trauma, which is our country, not only mine. And you then have a very weak terrain on which you're actually building this new sandcastle of democracy. And what it's standing on are all these remnants of the deeper substratum of history, society, sociology. You're absolutely right, Venelin. I think, you know, there's a need to understand the sociology of these societies, not to mention then the ethnic differences and the various communist elites in our country who, you know, tried to retain power and went, you know, understood that nationalism was a great tool, which, you know, as we've all said, we were sort of the harbinger, and so, whereas we were thinking we were the exception to the wonderful Westminster democracy and the US, you know, we were to find out later that we were not the exception, but something that announced a new wave of populism. And then this movement to Europe, which was genuine, because, you know, you were regaining a richer sort of lost family that you had found through historical dynamic, took you in, and, you know, those who came in did it at the right time, whereas some of us others did this early nativist, identitarian illusion that if you were doing it by yourself, you could somehow do it better, taking back control by yourself, and then only realizing that it was an illusion, and that you were, if you were to survive, supposed to join this bigger world, because that was the only savior, however unsavory that capitalist world out there was. And just, you know, in passing, as many sort of factories are closing down because of the on-time supply chain, just 2 days ago it was announced that the car factory in Serbia, Fiat, was also going to stop or slow down because there weren't parts from China coming. I didn't realize that that factory also had parts from China. I thought, you know, they were from other parts of Europe or Italy, etc., but there were only parts of China. So, you know, someone talked about deglobalization. I think it was Ivan. Yeah, that's a real question, you know. Is it possible at all? And even is it even minimally possible to deglobalize? And, you know, what is the price? And as our Slovak friends have been saying, you know, they will be the first victims if the German car producers suddenly are hit by tariffs, or China closes down, or the US starts closing down. So there are really bigger things that are out there and that are rolling behind the hill. One big question that I think, and this is, you know, under the rubric of not only trying to understand, which is extremely important, it is also trying to understand, but it's also what is to be done. And sort of this is the somewhat activist part of myself. I think there's a lack, at least in my country, of oppositional intellectual forces trying to understand why is it that these populist leaders who are leaning, who have authoritarian leanings, what is it that makes them popular? You know, so yeah, we mentioned Poland and the help to families, and whatever the equivalents that Orban is engaged in, you know, handouts, you know, and sort of elements of social welfare that have disappeared being brought in, but also giving, you know, whether illusionary or not, a sense of certainty to these people, a sense of security. Again, whether perceived or real, I think this is something that you know, anyone who tries to oppose these incumbents has to look at and take something out of the playbook that they are using. Clearly, I mean, it's all been mentioned. The media are under control or largely under control, but at the same time, there's a lot of information that's around there. I mean, anyone who wants to be informed through social media that are spreading can do so. What you have, and this is, I think, what we witnessed from early on, from the 90s, is that in these weakly institutionalized democracies early on in the 90s, the tools that are being used by successful political parties are the kind of spaceship Cambridge Analyticas of this world. So they are using kind of algorithms that are tracking plus positive and negative opinions on Twitter and Facebook as the president or the prime minister goes on television. And in the advertising break, the advisor goes in and says, well, you've gone too far on this, you have to apologize or rectify, and they go. So, you know, to put it all too simply, the incumbents are driving, you know, spaceships, and the opposition are on bicycles, or some version of that. And that's an issue that we are also, that is the reality of the issue. Not that the opposition, you know, getting its own small spaceship will, you know, make our democracy better. It probably won't, but at least it will be a level playing field if they come up with ideas. I think Venelin mentioned leadership in passing, and this is a bigger issue, and it relates to the relationship of these countries to Europe itself. We were talking yesterday at dinner with Jacques, who traveled to Poland with President Macron. You know, whatever we think of him, he is the only one who's had this positive message on Europe that is not Europe bashing, that everyone else has used from London to Budapest and backwards. You know, the ultimate scapegoat for everything, you know, from the shape of banana to the rest of it. Very, very useful tool in domestic politics to have an outside player on which to blame. There has been on the European side a definite lack of leadership message on what Europe means, and to put it all I think the message should be, you will not be less French if you're part of the European Union. You will not be less Serbian if you join the European Union. You can still drink your rakia, you know, and have your goat cheese from the farm. Nobody will take that away. But that is the message that has been used by the nationalists. Yes, you will be less Serbian. You will disappear, in fact, if you become Europe. Your soul will be taken away. Your Christian religion will be taken away. And you will be forced into a straitjacket, a Procrustean bed, that, you know, the imitation syndrome. And I think there's been on of course, in the countries themselves, a lack of that to try and explain, you know, we will remain Slovak, but it is the only way to save ourselves as Slovakia if we are part of something bigger. There's been a total absence of that kind of explanation that goes out there, rather than simply and wanting simply to focus on oneself. And so, not to belabor all of this, I think that I think one of the deeper questions is obviously, and this goes to the broader issue that Jacques raised at the beginning. It's the character of politics globally, and what is happening to politics. Clearly, the apathy, the cynicism, and the complacency of the modern citizen, whom, to repeat again, people like Constance say, does not have to be involved in politics to be a good citizen, and there we have a problem. But as you remember, Constance's famous essay on the liberty of the ancients and the modern ends up by saying, but wait a minute, somebody has to watch what those guys or gals who we've elected are doing. And so not everyone can go just tend to their garden, but they have to be involved. What is it and how is it that we mobilize, quote unquote, citizens to actually care for what is being done, even though they feel that life is okay, that they have something minimum, a salary that they can fend for their kids. And what is that breaking moment when they choose to vote for the opposition or rebel and revolt, go out into the streets? And in all our countries, people have been out on the streets massively. But as all of us and Ivan and others have been asking, where does that energy end up? Nothing happens with it. These are leaderless, in the good sense, anarchic movements. We don't want have a hierarchy. We just want to voice our kind of protest at this. So. To go back to this question, is this a passing moment? Is this the ebb and flow that we've seen throughout history? I think there is an ebb and flow, and that we are in whatever this particular moment of populism is an ebb or a flow, but it's there. But it's a mixed picture. I will raise the example of Emilia-Romagna, where Salvini was hoping to make a big score, and then people mobilized, and our friend Elie Schlein, who made it into the New York Times with a big article, they managed to mobilize a whole swathe of people, and Salvini was defeated in this particular election. As was said, he's not out. But it shows that if people understand what what comes behind the hill, as we say idiomatically in my language, if they are presented the negative effects of neo-Nazis, of far-right people, of these kinds of situations where you close yourself, they can be actually mobilized. So. Many people had answering this question, what is to be done? Well, politics needs to be, Adam yesterday, explained from his millions of conversations with people, there's simply this distrust in politics. We all see it. How do we bring back the trust in politics, showing its rational side rather than its manipulative side? And how is it that there's, as others have said, a sort of ennobling of politics? Very tough task, given the kind of nature of the mediatized social media world that we live in, but definitely something that I think is opposing it. And again, whether it was Čaputova's victory, we'll see what happens on Saturday in Slovakia. I think it'll be another important sign of where we're going. And the way that Germany is unfortunately in a complete state of stasis, I think is extremely worrying. And as has been warned, this is a country that we hinge on, and France cannot do it by itself. And the southern European countries are in different stages of turmoil, but also showing that it is possible to reverse at moments this populist trend. So I think to finally conclude, the jury is out on actually this stage of the ebb and flow. But given the global challenges, the fact that the US is doing what it's doing, the fact that China is probably the only power in the world that has a clear strategy of where it wants to be in 30 years' time and is slowly moving their truck forward, unimpeded, while coronavirus is a bit of an impediment. We have, I think, to through the work that we're doing, help Europe actually try to stand up a little more firmly in this world than it is standing at the moment.
Okay, so now, comments and questions. Ivan first.
It was a very interesting conversation because I'm in chief today, so 10 to 6 I should be out. I do believe Venelin made a very important methodological question, that in order to explain what went wrong, we should integrate what went right. And I very much agree with this, because in a certain way, part of the things that went wrong probably are based on the things that went right. I don't believe that Zizek is as important as you believe. I have not seen any major policymaker being basically influenced by Zizek. So from this point of view, no, but this is an important problem, because when you stay in the academia, certain people stay very big. But when Zizek goes for the policymakers, he's an entertainment. This is not the idea. And this is the three things that I wanted to make on the base of this. You are absolutely right when you go that Zacharias' idea of illiberal democracy has nothing to do with what we're discussing there, because basically his article was a criticism to the democratic transition paradigm, in which he said electoral democracy is not automatically to bring the rule of law. He was in this debate. And we are not in this debate, and you're totally right that now illiberal democracy is based about the self-identification of the authors, and this goes with, particularly Orban is the most articulate. But there are two things that Orban articulates, and in a certain way you try to get out of, and this is the problem of sovereignty. You can never understand what is illiberal democracy if the idea is democracy is based on sovereignty. Political community that can take a sovereign decision. And basically liberalism is eroding this. So, and this is instinct in a certain way is very strong, because strangely enough, you can see it in every democracy. The moment basically Britain starts to discuss Russia today to be allowed to function or not is a classical story. Nobody wants anybody to interfere in their domestic politics. But at the same time, in a global world, and particularly now with this type of permissive information area, everybody can interfere, and even more, you don't know who interferes. So from a certain point of view, this kind of a search for sovereignty is critically important, and this is based also on certain type of things which are not just the invention of these people. Part of what happened to Orban was the effect of the 2008-2009 crisis on Hungary. And during the Hungary, it happens that all the major banks remained loyal to the places from which they come and not for the places where their operations were. As the head of Bank of Britain used to say, banks are global when they're alive, but they're national when they bankrupt. And from this point of view, he had a major decision to make. 1 million Hungarians have basically borrowed in Swiss francs, and the Swiss francs basically foreign ratio went 40%. So he said, the state has the right to save the middle class. And this is what he did. He put the price on the banks. So in a certain way, I do believe, here Adam is right, that the relations between democracy and the market always was, and this is true for all populist movements, both on the left and on the right, they claim the primacy of the politics. It is not about believing big government. This I disagree. I don't believe that the Polish government, by the way, Polish government is fiscally extremely stable and conservative government, but they said in the emergency situation, democracy is about the government to have the right to save certain constituencies. And this is what is not allowed us. And this is why I do believe it's not so easy to argue against these people, because some of the points that they're doing are valid points. They're using this valid point to justify policies which are destroying institutions, they're destroying this, they're destroying that. But on a certain point of view, and this is my last point, go also closer to the idea of the legal impossibilism, the famous Kaczynski story. So basically Kaczynski said, people voted me for revolution. They don't like what is happening. I can do nothing. Central bank is not allowing me to change economic policy. European Union is not allowing me this. The judges all the time of voting out. How I can be responsive to my voters with so much constraints? And I do believe this is also very interesting in the Hungarian case, because Hungarian case is so clear, because also by luck he ended up with constitutional majority. So in a certain way, you basically can do anything that you want. You basically change the rules. And here comes my story. To what extent the rise of illiberalism was not very much the result for the same problem we see the financial crisis. Before the financial crisis, economists convinced themselves that we're beyond the business cycles. They are not bust and booms. In a certain way, we have regulated the reasonable kind of a narrow passage of decisions, and people should not be allowed to move out of it. And I do believe on political level, we did something like this. Basically, you tell the people, listen, you can choose between this and that, center left, center right, you can do this and that, and beyond it you cannot go. But this is based only to the moment when people are satisfied with the status quo. If they're not satisfied with the status quo, if they want to go for a radical change, they're going to be pushed to go against the system in one way or the other. So from my point of view is exactly because it was successful to achieve certain things, but because it didn't give a perspective for people for radical change when there was a demand for radical change, you end up with political leaders which are not anti-democratic. Particularly, I don't believe that Kaczynski is a classical authoritarian. He basically simply does not believe in the neutral institutions. So which means that every institution that is not controlled by me is controlled by my enemy. It's a return to Carl Schmittian idea of politics, but I do believe if we are not going to recognize certain type of a legitimacy of certain anxieties and problems and that people came as a result of a successful transition, we will not go there. So from this point of view, you're right that neoliberalism explains too much everything easier, but what I'm going to call not neoliberalism, but certain idea of constrained understanding, too constrained understanding of democracy, particularly when it comes to economic policies, probably contributed to this. And this is not by accident that European Union, in many of these places, this kind of a movement became an anti-EU movement because EU was perceived as the embodiment of the constraints, in a certain embodiment of what you cannot do.
I think that this panel was quite interesting for me because I felt that actually people come from quite different ideological perspectives. I think it would be an exaggeration to say that you agree 85% with disagree. This I believe. Yeah. Okay. Now, I just wanted to ask several things to make matters a bit clearer to me. Now, Venelin, the way I understand the term you're using, democratic backsliding, it's something that follows a period of success between the 1980s and the 2000s. And what strikes me here is what is success in terms of building liberal democracy, and I'm sure that there was quite a lot of success in this respect, coincided at the same time with great suffering for people in many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, certainly where I come from in Bulgaria, and from everything I've read and seen in Russia even more so. And I just wonder whether this doesn't explain, is not one of the factors that explains also the democratic backsliding, that the very fact that the successful building of liberal democracy can actually bring and coincide and coexist with failing to deliver for many, many people. So this is one, I don't know if I express myself clearly. And then the other thing is that I was a bit worried about myself because you described a lot of these ideas of the anti-new liberal narrative. And I felt I agreed with them, and this worried me. But I don't think that I don't feel I'm on the same side of Orban or Kaczynski and all of that, because I do believe in liberal values. But that tells me that there must be a lot of people who believe in liberal values and at the same time find very similar problems that Orban and others of that sort have articulated, but surely they would come up with different solutions and reach different conclusions. So I wonder why this is so, and I wonder if it doesn't reveal something about the complexity of the situation, that you have people from different sort of ideological perspectives agreeing about where the problem starts, but coming up with different answers of what needs to be done.
Do you want to respond now?
I can respond now.
Yeah, there was a question to Venelin and to you, and Ivan's comment was more general. Unless you want to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, I just thought I'd run through three things. The first thing is the Hungarian housing market is fascinating and crazy, and I just want to kind of build on what Ivan was saying. I mean, I didn't know till I was looking into it recently that they had a round of quantitative easing in 2018, when it was already clearly a bubble. You asked the question, why are these governments popular? The one way to begin with that is, why do they think they're popular? What are they doing? What crazy things do they do that they think they surely they have to do in order to maintain their popularity? And to me, the most obvious example, looking at Hungary, but you can say this about Istanbul and Turkey as well. We were talking about this earlier. You look at the stats about the Istanbul housing market. It's very clearly, if you go there, the most ridiculous bubble that we've seen since Ireland and Spain and Portugal in 2007. And so the first thing is, Hungarian economic policy is very clearly geared towards pumping up a massive housing bubble. And the only reason you do that, knowing the risks as you do, because they're not stupid, is if you think your support is dependent on the continuing inflation of asset prices. So presumably that's what they think they have to do. Continue. I mean, I could bang on for ages about the long list of policies they've got to inflate the housing bubble, but it's most of their economic policy. It seems to be geared towards huge asset price inflation. The second thing I want to say, again, sort of in response to what Ivan was saying, not disagreeing, but just to build on that, and this is partly what I was going to say before I changed what I was going to say, is I think that, for me, the kind of most important point in a way about a lot of this is that the prevailing narrative about anti-liberalism, if what we mean by that is a sort of dislike of LGBT people, of women's rights, etc., is that these things come up from the working class to the top. And I see very little evidence for that. I think, in the work we do on this subject, what's going on is quite clear that this is coming down from the top. So, to give you some examples, 18 months ago I was in Zagreb, and there were people on every street corner getting petitions signed to oppose the Istanbul Convention. And when we went, which is on gender violence, and we talked to them about why it was because they're against trans rights. Now, where have they got this idea that they hate trans people? They've probably never knowingly met a trans person. This isn't a sort of part of their daily experience, and yet they're dedicating their lives to campaigning on this. Or in Košice last week when I was there, I was talking to a guy outside the ice hockey stadium who started talking about gender ideology. He knew his English wasn't very good, but he knew the English term for gender ideology. Now, he didn't just come up with this idea that he hates trans people. This is something that's come to him. And so last year, my colleagues and I, we went through all the financial returns of the major American conservative organizations, which are mostly funded by the famous American billionaires many of you will heard of, and also the big kind of upper middle class churches in America, the evangelical churches in America, and found that in the last 5 years they've pumped about about 35 million pounds of dark money into Europe, promoting exactly these messages and setting up grassroots organizations in places like Croatia, in places like Slovakia, promoting these ideas. So the point is that I think we need to be very careful not to perpetuate the idea that bigotry is a phenomenon which starts at the working class and goes up, and that all our middle class friends are sort of much better and the elites are not bigoted at all, when the data doesn't show that, the evidence doesn't show that, and certainly I'd say that the research we do consistently shows that bigotry is a tool promoted by the ruling class in order to persuade working class people to blame someone other than them for their problems. The third thing I want to say is just in response to your comment, which is that the vast majority of people in the world can see some basic facts. They understand that the planet's burning. They understand that over the last 40 years, inequality has soared. They understand there's deep feelings of economic insecurity. They understand that they have very little power over the political system and probably less and less power than they used to have. And they can therefore see that the system is failing. And most of politics is a debate about how to replace the system that is clearly failing. And there's a few people who are trying to cling on to a system which is very obviously failing. And I think that, that to say that all these people agree is obviously not true. Some people who are very right-wing can see the system's failing because it obviously is. Other people who are very left-wing, some people in the middle, lots of people with all kinds of political ideas understand the system is failing. And to spend the time saying, why is it that all these people agree that the system is failing, is to fail to understand the reality of the world, which is, unless we radically change the system, the planet will burn and we'll all die.
Venelin, would you like to respond to some of the comments?
Sure. Thanks, Ivan. Very helpful comments. You and I disagree on this thing about lack of choice. As you know, I do think that in the 90s in particular, there were moments when the choice was very real. You can even say turning points. Bulgaria in 97, Slovakia and Romania in 98. The elections did make a lot of difference, that the countries followed a very different trajectory. So I think the point you and Steve make in the book, that there was no choice, this is a little bit of a simplification. Second, rhetoric, constraints. I cannot do this because I'm constrained by the IMF. This is obviously rhetoric. When you steal money, you cannot just say, I stole the money, that's why I cannot increase your... You find an excuse. There's not money. Well, the reason there isn't money because you stole it. But of course you blame it on the IMF. So I do not think that, politically speaking, there were so many constraints on, policy making in Eastern Europe in the 90s or the 2000s. Kaczynski is being very strategic. It's simply empirically not true that the Polish Constitutional Tribunal has interfered in economic policy making. It's just not true. The tribunal deals with other issues: judicial independence, individual rights, religion, this. But whether the government should redistribute 40% or 60%, there has never been a case about. So Kaczynski is blaming the court, but that's because he wants to control the court. We need to be a little bit aware of the fact that, politicians may be manipulative. The Schmittian point, yes, the issue of sovereignty is there, but Schmitt is helpful, which is what I'm working on right now, how Carl Schmitt can help us understand democratic backsliding. But there's an interesting twist with the Schmittian, paradigm, friends and foes, extraordinary the state of emergency. And the interesting point, and in that sense, I think both Kaczynski and Orban have two faces, so to speak, is that actually they justify everything they do as normal. They do not say what we have is a state of emergency, therefore we need to forget about the Constitution, we need to suspend it. None of them has suspended the Constitution. Quite the contrary. They do something and then they say, well, that's pretty normal because that's how they do it in Netherlands, that's how they do it in Germany, how they appoint judges. That's not Schmittian, right? This is or if you will, the proverbial Schmittian decision of what happens is a state of emergency, and that's who the sovereign is, whoever says we have a state of emergency, that's the Schmittian paradigm. In Eastern Europe, it's the exact opposite. Whoever is able to say what's happening is normal, that's the sovereign. Because, they've been challenged by those who say what you do is actually extraordinary. They say, no, it's normal. Which again is not to dismiss the Schmittian thinking about how sovereign exertions. Yes, I'm not dismissing it, and I'm still grappling with it, But that's what I would say. Clemena, suffering in the 90s, yes, of course, there was a lot of suffering. We can probably argue about the causes of that suffering. It really strikes me as inexplicable. The fact that in the discussions about the suffering of the 90s, the notion of the legacies of communism has all but disappeared. We talk about this period as if The suffering came about causally because of the reforms. What about, the economic, social, cultural legacies of communism? This was a very lively conversation. The legacies of communism, there was books, there were in the 90s, and then it was all eclipsed by this, blame the neoliberal. Now forget about that. Actually now there's a different, how positive were the legacies actually of communism? Solidarity, not the Polish sort, like people felt more solidarity, there was this, nice, the quality of life, nostalgic, yeah. And that is really, I cannot understand this. I mean, places of the world like Africa, India, they still talk about the legacies of colonialism. In the United States, they still talk about, for a good reason, by the way, the legacy of slavery. In Eastern Europe, it's like the 90s, end of it, and then forget about communism. Let's look at the democratic liberal era. That's where the cause of all suffering is. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that these societies went through this suffering while maintaining their liberal democracies. This is quite remarkable, I would say. This is quite a serious cultural achievement. I fully agree with Professor Rupnik's point that economic variables, or economic factors, are irrelevant for understanding. There is no suffering right now. There is no, poverty has declined dramatically. People have jobs, people have disposable income, probably not as much as they would like to. So I fully agree with your analogy of the 2 lanes and the fast cars. But no, this is not an economic phenomenon. This is a cultural phenomenon. This is probably a psychological phenomenon, but certainly not economic. And as to your doubts about whether you're a secret Orbanite or I guess all of us will have to, wow, my God, I agree with Orban. I mean, I've had these moments with Paul Krugman, actually. Paul Krugman. I said, oh, I agree with Paul Krugman. This shouldn't be happening. So all of us have but it is a matter of definition. Again, probably we need to do more conceptual work on this distinction between liberals and neoliberals. I'm not exactly sure which way we should go with this distinction. I mean, there's the general conceptual level, which is one thing, but then there's Eastern Europe. Again, I think in Eastern Europe, this is a very difficult distinction to draw. But my advice would be don't freak out. We are complicated beings, and besides there's the subconscious, which always surprises. So it may turn out that on a subconscious level you like the, Orbanian approach to policy making.
Just legacy. Populists are very strong on communist legacy. If you go to the discourse of Kaczynski, if you go to the discourse of Orban, but for them communism did not end in 1989. This is one of the strongest discourse, and basically they said the whole period before us communism never ended because the communist elites have been controlling the situation. So from this point of view, your accusation that basically the communist legacy discourse has disappeared, not for these people.
Okay. Okay.
Well, this is just a follow-up on what Ivan was saying. I mean, the main argument of Kaczynski and actually of Orban was, first of all, you have the network, the communist network. They did a deal. 1989 was not a revolution. It was an agreement between the moderate dissidents and the moderate communists. And it was a fraud. This is how privatization happened, etc., etc. This was a birth of the liberal consensus we are revolting against. And we have to dismantle the network, Układ, in Polish, the sort of conspiratorial kind of thing. We have to dismantle the network, and we have to do the true revolution that didn't happen. And we have to do the decommunization. This is why last week, this is why we have to replace the judges. This is a new law in Poland. You have to appoint all the judges. Why? You wonder? Oh, because they are the guys who did terrible things under, martial law in Poland. Martial law is 1981. I mean, these guys were in, you know, were in pioneer camps in 1981. They were not communist judges or anything like that. This is like 30 years after communism. We had this discussion during lunchtime, you know, when people keep bragging about the communist legacy. So for them, this is communist legacy, but purely used for political purpose. They are not serious about chasing communist judges in Poland today. Anyway, I didn't mean to, but since I have the mic, I might as well use it. No, this is just following your comment about neoliberalism. Maybe it's overdone and maybe people use it too conveniently to demonize or blame everything. When in doubt, you know, blame it on neoliberal policies or what have you. But still, that dodges the distinction between economic and political liberalism. What happened in the post-89 was this alliance of the political and economic liberals. And this is what has backfired. This is what has broken apart. And I think this is worth exploring further. I mean, you have two interesting takes on that. On the economic liberalism, there's Marcin Kroll's essay, Byliśmy głupi, we were stupid. and he describes the infatuation of dissident liberal intellectuals with the economic gurus. You know, Balcerowicz, oh, he knows how to do it. We don't understand economics, but, you know, and he says that was a terrible mistake, and he sort of, with hindsight, sort of does a sort of self-criticism, you could call it, but kind of collective. And then you have on the political liberalism, that was something else. You have another attack, but from a completely opposite side, from Legutko. He says, no, the mistake is political liberals. What is it they bring us? They bring us this European mix of gender, gays, LGTB, what have you, multiculturalism, which is destroying the nation, the family, etc. And on this, in these culture wars, the new nationalists, conservatives, whatever you want to call them, are closer to Putin and the ideologists in Russia than to what you have elsewhere in Europe. They consider Europe decadent, weak, permissive, and something that on top of that is so arrogant as wanting to impose you these norms. So this is going not only against democratic sovereignty, etc. And so this is interesting because they are, of course, rabid anti-Russian in foreign policy. But in terms of their cultural, societal criticism of European liberalism, they're pretty close to what you get from the Putin stable. And actually it is worth reading some of that stuff. There is this guy Dugin, worth reading, I mean, so I recommend. And Surkov had last year a very interesting article about basically justifying, he talks about Putin's long term. Dolgoje gospodarstwo Putina. Long. This is his long term. Yeah, this is it. Western democracy is hypocritical. Western liberal democracy is hypocrisy. We at least are explicit. Yes, we want to strongly. We want to, because there is deep state, but there is a deep people. He uses the term deep people. This is for populism. You want to understand populism? This is deep people. There is deep state and deep people. And deep people identify with a strong leader. Guess whom? Etc. So in this mode, I mean, they formulate it in a much more blunt way than Orban in his illiberal speech. Illiberal speech made everybody shake in Western Europe. But the real thing is the other one. Yeah, and I'm talking too long. But final footnote about Carl Schmitt. In Polish parliament, the oldest and one of the most prestigious MPs for peace, the father of Morawiecki, the prime minister, made a great speech where he actually quotes Carl Schmitt. Because there's opposition saying, but we have voted this, we have majority. No, and he says, there is nothing that can be contrary to the will of the nation. There is nothing above the will of the nation. So you people here, parliamentarians, you can chat, but there is nothing against the will of the nation. It just so happens that we represent it. So this is Carl Schmitt revisited by peace. It is in the family of the prime minister, so it's in safe hands, and to be continued here.
I should go after deep people and deep state. I'll go for deep purple.
Okay, so do we have more time for discussion? How much longer? I don't have 10 minutes. Okay, so we don't have much more time. Maybe before taking further comments, I would just like to comment briefly on Venelin's expose. I like the way you systematized the problem, the questions, and posed the problem, but I would not agree with all the inferences you made. I do think that Krastev is correct when he says there is no alternative. And this is what explains, according to me, this negative definition of illiberalism as ideology. So it's a non to the only existing ideology. I agree with you that there is a conflation between neoliberalism and liberalism, that these are two different things and that we have to be intellectually vigilant and distinguish the two, not commonsensically conflate them. I agree with that comment. Nevertheless, I disagree with this idea that neoliberalism is some kind of a spontaneous occurrence of pure economy, of a naturalized economy, of naturalized capitalism, actually. I would agree with David Harvey when he says that neoliberalism has always been an ideological project and highly political, and that it's a myth, a completely misleading actually conception, and the devil has fooled us that he does not exist by believing that there is anything deregulated about neoliberalism. Quite to the contrary, in The Enigma of Capital, he explains how actually overly regulated politically this deregulation was. So, according to him, it's a political project. And one more remark about Schmitt. And why does it have to do with the matter we discuss here? Schmitt does not only explain us how the state of exception is declared, but also how laws are made. So that the law actually originates as if ex nihilo, and the law is literally, it's a law because I said so. So there is an initial violence in this law, in lawmaking itself. And Krastev is correct, I think, when he insists that this is something that the populists recognize and exploit. And according to me, by doing so, they manage to create this aura around them of authenticity, of being more real than the duplicitous liberals. This is what Trump is admired for. He's real. He talks like it is. So I think that exposing the fact that this whole thing is structured, constructed, that there is nothing natural or spontaneous, both about liberal democracy and about lawmaking and the alleged division of powers is what creates this impression of authenticity. And it's peculiar to realize that they're actually winning on this, on metaphysical grounds, if you wish. They seem more real, more sincere than, this hallucinatory world of the globalization of the 90s. So, because I am supposed to moderate, I had to comment something. So I commented, I believe, all of the three presentations. And if we have 5 more minutes, I assume, we can... you have one more comment.
Sure, yeah. I suppose I just want to say that we call them populists, but my experience is these people really aren't very popular. If you go to Nyíregyháza, which is a very strongly Fidesz voting place, or you go to, you go to Biella in northern Italy or Novara in northern Italy, very strongly Lega voting places, it's very hard to find people who like the people they vote for. If you go to Northern Ireland and talk to DUP voters, they hate them, as I was talking about yesterday. If you go around the north of England and talk to people who voted for Boris Johnson, they usually hate him. There's not, this idea that populists are popular, I think is often based on a failure to talk to people who support them about why they support them. And what's also true, though, is that if you offer people a choice between Hillary Clinton and a regime people can see is entirely broken and corrupt, and Donald Trump, they'll choose Donald Trump. If you offer people a choice between David Cameron and Brexit, they'll choose Brexit. If you offer them a choice between Orban and Bajnai, I don't know how you pronounce his name, austerity and authoritarianism, they'll always choose the alternative to the status quo they see as entirely broken. But it's not the case that these people are popular, and the task that we have is to talk to them, to talk with them, and to build up a popular alternative to what they're being offered. Because at the moment, the only people talking with people in the places that vote for authoritarians and populists are the authoritarians and populists, and that's why we keep losing. I wanted to finish on a quick question, which is, I wonder how many people in this room, you could put your hand up, have ever knocked on the door of a stranger to talk about politics?
Could you repeat that? Could you repeat that?
My question was, how many of you, and can you put your hands up, have ever knocked on the door of a stranger or stopped a stranger in the street or whatever to talk about politics? I mean, literally.
Not especially traveling, maybe not on the street, but yeah.
Canvassing, yeah.
Oh yeah, I did.
Okay, any more comments?
Well, I am really grateful to you for this idea of the negative definition. I think this is quite enlightening, and forces us to think about the improvisational component of politics, because they do have to improvise. And yeah, Orban keeps switching from illiberal democracy, which hasn't been mentioned recently, I agree with you, to conservatism, and makes you wonder, how does he appear authentic all the time? Schmitten lawmaking, surely what he called motorized legislation did arrive in Eastern Europe in the 90s, both in the countries that wanted to enter the EU, because this is what the adoption of the acquis was. It was just without any, but also countries like Macedonia that were not involved in the eastward expansion. It was still however, still this doesn't explain the slide towards illiberalism, because, parliamentary procedures in Eastern Europe haven't really changed all that much since the 90s. Laws are being passed quickly and without deliberation. However, the general directionality of political development, that has changed. It used to be towards liberal democracy in the 90s, so that by the early 2000s there were many countries but several countries in the region which were legitimately labeled, and then that changed. So it seems that we cannot just invoke Schmidt's idea that parliamentarism has been perverted, which unfortunately I think is correct. But that in itself doesn't suffice as an explanation of the change of direction.
Yeah, just very briefly and all too simplistically, the kind of rubber stamping parliamentarianism that all these countries of the so-called new member states went through is, you know, I sort of liken it to the metaphor of university. You know, you enter and you know that you'll get a diploma in the end, and you cram for exams for 4 years, and if you're really diligent, you finish it in 3 years. If you're a laggard, like many in Eastern Europe were, in my country, you study for 15 years. But let's say you do it for 4 years, and you know it's tough. It's a really a kind of pressure cooker where you go through, and then you know you binge after you get your diploma. And so, you know, as I say, it's all too simplistic, but there's been a sort of binging. And I would say, and this is something that we need to look at, you know, the fact that you enter the quote-unquote playpen of the European Union, which is safe because parents are standing around it, and, you know, you have all the toys inside, you can sort of binge playfully in the safety of the framework. And I think that the really high levels that we have in nearly all of the member states, maybe barring Greece and Italy at this point, of support for the European Union, when asked, you know, has the European Union been good for you, or do you think it's good to be in the European Union? You get anywhere between, you know, 55 and 75% of the countries. And I think that's a very important moment in all of this, because you can, you know, make strange decisions in your vote, but somehow in the back of your mind, you know that there is, and I think somebody mentioned it this morning in debate, you know, there is the foolproof overseer who will stop you as you want to go over the cliff. Now, we're seeing that tested, and I agree with what Jacques was saying about the EPP. You know, it is a really important part of this equation. You know, where does it go, and does it hold the ground of democracy and democratic values? But I think in the grand scheme of things of what we're looking at, you know, what does it mean to be a member of the European Union? I don't believe for a second in what Putin said about 2028, that, you know, once the funds disappear, that countries will slowly leave, because I think, you know, when you look at at some of the very practical things, you know, to be a citizen of the European Union from another country than Austria makes life much more easier than for me, who am not a member of the European Union living in Austria. Simply the easiness of you know, free travel and whatever you call it, and documents and other things, you know, not to mention Schengen and the euro, whatever you think about it, there's a huge ease of living, and not to mention businesses, of course, whose life is much easier because there are no, you know, tariffs and checks at the borders, is just humongous. And so when you start breaking it down and listing all the things that people have benefited, yeah, neoliberal or liberal economies, whatever you want to call it, and all the inequalities that it creates. Nonetheless, the fact of being part of this bigger family and union has brought huge benefits to the citizens. And, you know, I love the quote of Nikola Dimitrov, the North Macedonian foreign minister, when asked in the Netherlands by a journalist, you know, why do you want to join this thing? I mean, look at it, it's falling apart, you know, and all this. And his simple answer was, you don't know what it is to be outside. So I truly believe that, you know, that's something that we haven't mentioned, but, you know, there is something about being in this, you know, as we call it, the most successful peace project and all of that. And the EU simply doesn't know how to sell itself a little better and a little more forcefully. And as, you know, people have been saying, with a little more power projection. And I would definitely, you know, if I come to write about this, that'll be an element that I think is extremely important.
Thanks a lot. A wonderful comment for the end. I don't know if somebody else wants to add something, or should we close the discussion for now? Okay, I'm closing the discussion. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for contributing to the discussion.